Hello everyone, it's Chris here. Welcome to the book show. I'm grateful to have you here. I hope you can understand me. Yes, I do know I don't speak that clearly. That's the way I speak, man. So luckily when you read something or you listen to the audio of the books, you should be able to get the picture a bit more. But anyway, I want to speak today about the very first book I actually wrote ever in my life, which is called Mean Streets 1. In other words, full title of a book is dreadfully long. It's Mean Streets, Life in the Apartheid Police, Book 1, College Days. The name itself had brought a lot of problems for me because people really took exception to the word apartheid police. A lot of people, saw that as not being loyal and being disrespectful to the old police force. Now, I'm really careful when I speak about my police days to use the word police force. Die polisie mag. Because that had nothing to do with the police service, which I actually hold in utter contempt. But perhaps wrongly so, if you look at how full the prisons are, then they can't be that bad, as I also acknowledge in my books. But, for me, we was used to a very disciplined paramilitary type of police with its own air wing, with its own special forces, with its own army in the sense of the police counterinsurgency units, which were a lot more experienced than the army, simply because they've been fighting, I think, from 1966 in Rhodesia already. So that's where the SAP coin, but we speak about that in the second book. Where SAP coin counterinsurgency units actually got their knowledge from is from the Rhodesian Bush War. And that was many, many years before the National Service call-ups really started coming in. And I don't take away anything from the army. There used to be quite a feeling between the police and the army, and that's natural. I mean, it's two totally different types of people, organizations, and you always get, I see it on Legacy Conversations too, where that's the main channel. For you who don't know, that's where we speak to the military veterans as well as police veterans, intelligence veterans, and we can get hold of them. Where they tell their stories, because it's very important that the stories come out. It's important for the man who's telling his story, and it's important for history. Because you know how it is, what you read in the school books, history or university, is really bullshit. I've written many, many books, and there's a lot of history in all my books. I started reading at the age of 4 or 5. Perhaps I just turned 5 when I read my first book of 100 pages. And I'm fairly blessed that I remember what I read. And now I have to laugh at myself because, man, I can't remember word for word what I wrote in every book. Of course not. It's just too many and too long ago. But that's besides the point. I have a fairly good knowledge of history. In fact, I had a lot more knowledge of history than what the school teachers had. And I quickly found out there's different versions of the same history. It is my version, your version. The truth is somewhere in between, and it really depends on the author and whose side he is on and where sympathy is lying, because you can actually manipulate a book into something which you want, because it's a message. It's a message you're bringing out, and you have full control, especially if you're an independent author like myself. I'm not backed by any major publisher or anything. I self-published all the books. And I did that on purpose because after I left the police, I became an attorney. And I later specialized in contracts, so I really know how to write contracts and look at contracts and protect the client. And so I had one look at these major publishing companies at their contracts and told them to take a hike. I was actually much less polite than that. I told him to F off. I will never sign such crap and to go and hire decent attorneys and not rubbish I have in London. But anyway, I was also, I have to say, in those days, a bit of a difficult man. more difficult than now. I found peace when I found, may I say, when I found God, I found peace, man. I'm like, not the way I used to be. If I look back on my life, just the other day, I found a picture of myself as a young constable. In fact, it was on the very day that I passed out of having passing out parade at the police college in Pretoria in 1986. And I look at that young man and I look at myself and I think, wow, yeah, there's a song in Afrikaans, it's ver in die wêreld kitty. I don't know how to translate that. Far in the world kitty. I mean, it's an old song, probably from the Second World War, or even before that or after that. I don't know, but the song came up in my head because it's like you just went far. You traveled a lot of roads, and then you're not the same person. And I think all of you who's listening here will agree to me. You're not the same person as you used to be when you're 18 years old and you're young and you're strong and you want to take on the world, man, and you dream of a day that you can shoot a terrorist or a criminal or arrest a murderer or protect the innocent or what. But I think also I want to say that too. What I do realize is that the forming years of your life, in other words, what you underwent through in basic training, whether it was for Army or Air Force or Navy or Medical Corps, or perhaps the police like me or wherever, it did leave a mark. There's certain things in you which will never get out. And I do describe it here in this book as well, that even today, if I see these tattooed youngsters where I come from, if you see a person with tattoos, you watch him carefully, and if there's any chance to be able to shoot him and get away from shooting him, then of course you'll do it. He's just a damn surfer, man. He's like a takar. Takar is like a hippie. It's a long hair liberal, It's everything we don't like in life in the police. So those things are still inside you, and especially if this takar, this liberal thing, comes and he starts eating his food, and he normally doesn't use a knife and fork because, these things, you just slurp it down, It's like and you look at that and you think to yourself, wow, if my old sergeant had seen this fellow eating with his hat on his head. I'm a deeply religious man. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist and a serious one, and I wrote religious books like this one here, There, Sticking Out Hope of Evil, Born Protestantism. Yes, I mention it in every single lecture. Why do I do that? Simply because there's truths in it which you need to know. If you're a military man and you're listening to me, then I'll ask you if you have any type of intelligence which will declare to you what's going to happen in the future, that we call Bible prophecies. Why would you not want to know it? It's not. The book of Daniel and Revelation will explain to you everything you need to know on what's happening, what has happened, because history has proven every single word in the Bible. It's amazing, and it's in that book. But when I say in my book something like, God will not have mercy on you, and that's what I meant when I said my sergeant. I see my sergeant here in front of me, or one of them anyway. There were many who were tough bastards when they were working with decent people in general, honorable people, and they would not. If you sat there eating with your hat on your head, man, they knew how to deal with people, punks like you. Yeah, you would understand life. I mean, I've seen cadets, as I call them in the books, but the right title is actually student constable, which is a flippin' long name to write out. You have to write student constable number W for white. In those days, you were classified white, black, colored, whatever. Later, they changed your number. They took that away. They put other things in. But my number anyway was W for white, 412857, K for kilo. Now, a lot of you who were in the police actually would be able to place this number somewhere. Me too. If I see a guy's force number, I can tell you exactly which years basically he should have been in the force or when he enlisted. So that was my number, and then of course you get the rank of student constable, you have a power of arrest, everything, but you know so little that you shouldn't. Well, I say that there were a lot of, especially on the platteland in the rural areas, the policemen there stationed there would be actually well known to the student constables who arrive, and then they would accompany them out on the van, out to attend complaints and to make arrests and things like that. So many of them were quite experienced by the time they arrived for training. But I was not like that. I just sat in a child's office, dressed in civilian clothes. No student constable is ever dressed in police uniform unless he's on the training. And he cannot wear that uniform outside the training base, which is called the South African Police College in Pretoria West. I believe it's still there. And there's also, in the old days, it was known as the depot, police depot. And it's a dreadful place. As I said, if a sergeant would catch you eating with your hat on your head because you are damn liberal or something, I've seen men actually crawl on the tar with the sergeants just around them, They weren't kicking them in the ribs, but I'm sure they would have if I could have gotten away with it. So just made them leopard crawl up and down, run, carry each other until they start throwing up. That's how it went. And then you shut up and you clean up where you throw it up because you're a disgusting human being for doing such things. So the training in the police college was tough. Not, and I say this in a book as well, I don't think it was as tough as certain units in the army. I think a lot of abuse actually took place in the army. When I speak to people at Legacy, you can see actually where the structure broke down. And some people were just abused, physically by being hit on the head with something or whatever. Things like that should never have happened. And when you speak to the more senior officers, I will tell you if they knew about it, they would definitely have intervened. And I do believe that too. I do believe that. But having said that, I take nothing away from the police. It was tough enough. There is no such thing as a fat constable in those days. You came out of a police college a very, very fit young man or young woman. There were more than 1,000 of us were being trained 2 times a year, twice a year. I would say about 1,500 in total new policemen would arrive. That's just at that training depot. Of course, the black policemen had their own one at Hammanskraal. And then there were ones for the Indian policemen and one for the colored policemen as well. Later on, they had something called like a special constable, but that was also trained somewhere. I can't even remember where. So it was very segregated. So it was apart. It was not the same. It was not mixed. But besides that, everything else was the same. I mean, I would earn the same money as a black kid who joined the police. He would have the same benefits, same medical aid, which was fantastic. The police medical fund were fantastically good. And for good reason, man. You risk your life. And if something happened to you, of course you wanted to know you would be treated in hospital. That's also the difference between the police and the army as far as I can see. That policemen getting injured could be treated at a civilian hospital. Since the police had no hospitals, to be honest. Yes, there was one at the police college, but you would be treated as a private patient somewhere, so you could get the best treatment that the private sector could give you. Now, is that better than what the military could give you in their military hospitals? In those years, probably not, but it might have been. I don't know. I spoke to a Kufut member here that started off as a police counterinsurgency unit, and then it went over to the Southwest African Police, very famous unit, and he got injured, I think, in an explosion, and took him to the military hospital. He wasn't getting better, and so he booked himself out and booked himself into a private hospital, and there things started happening for him. So we had that choice, and Well, you of course paid a lot better than that a national serviceman would be paid. Yeah, I think my first salary was 483 rands a month. You know, later as an attorney, I would charge 1,000, 2,000 rands an hour, which came down to more than my pay as a sergeant in the police was 990 rands a month. Because I was a very young sergeant. So anyway, where did this book start from? Let me explain that. As I said, in 2012, I was not in a good place in life because then my life took a few surprising turns after I left the police. In 1985, I enlisted in the South African police force and I wanted to enlist. Let me be clear on that. I wanted to be a policeman simply because I knew I could do both. I could be a military man as well as a policeman at the same time, which you cannot be in the military, I think. I also initially I wanted to go to the military. Actually, I wanted to go to a military academy, but they told me I can't go because I took woodwork instead of maths at school, and that was deliberate too. I mean, I thought my woodworking skills, if I ever need a job, I would be able to, do the handyman thing or perhaps make furniture and sell it or something like that. I was thinking in that way, and I just couldn't see why I should take maths. I wasn't going to be a doctor or anything like that. I have a family of attorneys and legal people, advocates, things like that. So I knew if I ever wanted to go into law, there's no reason for me to have maths. So I had that figured out at an early age. Having said that, I was good at school. I was academically all right. In fact, in the beginning of my school years, I was always first in a class or out of the top 2 or 3. Then later I realized if you do that, you're in trouble always. The teacher started expecting more of you than what you necessarily wanted to deliver. So I made sure that I just did enough, at a 65, 70, 75 average. And with, of course, history, I was averaging 90% straight through. I was really good at it. But for me, I really liked woodworking. And yeah, there's a lot of people who look down upon us, who thought we were too stupid to do anything else. Well, I don't think we were. In fact, in Standard 9, I made something at woodworking which I think was under the top projects in the province of that year. So I was good at it, and also built a ship that was in Standard 7, which was actually on the radio on. People from the radio service came to interview me about my ship I built. It was a model. It was not a ship you can sail around to. But of course, it was a historical type of ship, one of these free deck line of war type of vessels, from the Battle of Trafalgar, that type of thing. I knew all these things. I read, man. I really read a lot. But I joined in 85, and then in 6 years later, in 91, end of 91, I realized it's over. Mr. Mandela was now released, and I could live with that. But what bothered me more was the unions were now starting to move into the police and the army. It was total disarray. You people who lived through it will know how that felt. I mean, I will never forget the 2nd of February of 1990 when it suddenly was said that Mandela is going to be released, and he was released a day or two later. I mean, our world just fell apart, man. We knew we were fighting on the side which has lost. Now, we might not have lost the battles. We won every single battle, but we also knew that these people are going to take revenge. We knew it, especially on the police. I mean, where the army could still sort of get out of it because they weren't that involved in South Africa, we were totally involved, and we knew. We knew. And man, we saw a bunch of else leaking like you've never seen before. You saw senior officers suddenly became ANC members. You've seen even the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Pik Botha, suddenly became a card-carrying member of the African National Congress of Mandela's people, and just look at them with utter contempt. Utter contempt. I know only of one general in the police, 2 of them actually, who actually stood up and said, "The buck stops with me. I gave the orders." Only two of them. The rest of them were just washing feet, washing feet. That's what they were doing. We felt betrayed. There's no doubt about it. On ground level, we felt betrayed. And then, of course, General Viljoen of the army came and he created his political movement. And a lot of us were seriously started thinking in terms of civil war. Yeah, we were wondering what's going to happen if these former national servicemen was combat soldiers. If they start going up, what we're going to do. And our own generals were very clear. If there was a revolt in South Africa, we would definitely take them on. We would start shooting at the army. And of course, the army would be shooting back. And then yes, your question is, where's the Air Force? It was really different times. Unless you lived through it, you wouldn't understand. And I do write about them in this book as well. I try to get people to understand what was going on. Our entire lives has collapsed. What was right was wrong, and what's wrong was suddenly right. Then they started changing the flag. They said the flag would be changed. We saluted that flag for many, many years. That was our bloody flag, man. And yes, that was taken away. Our language was taken away. Our ranks were taken away. Suddenly you were not a warrant officer in the police anymore, which is a wonderful rank. Sergeant Major in the army. No, now suddenly it's inspector. Inspector. Yeah, I drip of sarcasm when I say that. Why? It's a flippin'. They started bringing in, would you believe, people from the UK, from the bobbies on the beat in the UK. They started bringing them in to retrain us to what? We were already the most efficient police force you could ever imagine. And in Africa, it's not the same as in flippin' England, man. It's really not the same. I'll explain to you how it's not the same. There's a thing called the International Police Association, the IPA. It still exists. And you could join this association. And then if you're in a different country, you can go and visit the policeman there, and there'll be a bit of a braai or something, things like that. This policeman reaching out, probably a damn MI6 front or something, but I don't know that. I'm just saying. And so one of the inspectors arrived, and now he's going to work a night shift with us in the flying squad in Pretoria. Now, let me say to you, the flying squad in Pretoria is actually a fairly elite unit. And guys, when I say elite, I should rather say specialist unit, because it's not elite in the sense of a paratroopers or special forces. I'm not making that claim, but you do need a very different type of policeman in the flying squads. They're not the same as a guy driving the van around in your town, and they're definitely not the same as a guy who's, sitting there in a charge office and he doesn't want to go outside because he's scared and too fat. No, these were people who were dedicated. These were people who would respond to the most serious crime in the quickest time possible and sort it out. I always say to people, as a policeman, you don't have choices in life. You only have a law to follow. And I will talk about the law here in my notes as well. You have to run towards the danger. In other words, the shots are fired, that's where you run to. And I mean run. You have to get there. We got a call out to get somebody, to rescue somebody or go somewhere. In the flying squad, you had 4 minutes to get there. So if I get a call, my call sign was Romeo 4, which doesn't mean I was fourth in command of a unit, not at all. It just means the vehicle I was issued, Golf GTI, was called Romeo 4, because the call sign of the flying squads was always Romeo. At one stage it was something else, but that's before my time. I believe it was called Zulu or something like that, but we use the call sign Romeo. Romeo would be the radio control officers who controlled the entire city. And then you would call 10111. We actually answered within seconds. And then we would get the details. We would fill in a form. And then that form would go to the radio people. They would sit there. They would talk on the radio, call the vehicle something like Romeo 4, it's Romeo, and you'd say, Romeo 4, yeah, sent. And you had very, very good ways how you speak on the radio. Very well trained, and you kept to it. Well, anyway, then the complaint would come through. It would say, like, at this and this address, there's rape taking place or whatever. And then you respond. You put that siren on, and you go, like a bat out of hell. And you go, man. It's blue light, siren, everything. But I will speak about that in the second book as well, because you don't always use your siren. There were many, many methods which I think the public perhaps doesn't know about. But anyway, you would get there within 4 minutes. And sometimes your vehicle would actually be on fire. And I really mean that. By the time you stop, your brakes are burnt out. There's smoke coming from the wheels, from the tires. But you really wonder if you should pee on the wheel first before you attend to the criminal, to get that fire out, because it might be, it really looks like it's going to explode or something. And we used to burn out brakes on the Ford Sierras XR6 every 800 kilos. That's 2 night shifts when your brakes are gone. And your tires would last about 10,000 kilos. Think about that, because the police would only issue you new tires at 15,000. So that last 5,000 kilos, you're just waltzing around and playing Pretty Belinda when you go way down the streets, because there's no way that tires can grip anymore. So you just, I've seen police vehicles spun out doing 360s because the tires were just not there. And they simply, the police were like the Cinderella, we didn't get the money which the army was getting, and no complaints, guys, not hammering on the army at all. They were fighting huge wars and they needed the support. But we did feel that sometimes, we were ones who were keeping everybody safe at home. And we were fighting, of course, on all the borders, South Africa as well as the one in Novemberland, and before that in Rhodesia. There were even policemen involved in the Mau Mau in Kenya. Do you know that? Yeah. But anyway, so I go into those details more in the second book. The point I'm trying to make for you is that this IPA fellow then arrived, and he's like standing there, and I said this in other books as well, other lectures. When I say he's standing there and he's looking at us, and we're standing there, we cut our side arms, which you will not find us without, not even on the toilet. Our Z88 at that stage with extra magazines. Some of the guys had compensators on their pistols. Then you had either a Uzi or R4 or R5. Some guys had like a flashlight under it or a laser dot sight. You had like many magazines of ammunition. At one stage, I had a LMG, a mag machine gun in the car's boot with a couple of 100 rounds. I don't know why we actually had a machine gun mag at the unit, but we did. Point I'm trying to make is we're standing there, man. We loaded for gear. We expecting shootouts. We're expecting to run into terrorists or bank robbers or whatever. Same thing mostly. And this guy standing there, and his eyes are just this big. He doesn't know shite what's going on here. He thinks he's in a war zone. And they actually said that to us. Oh, no, you guys going to war. No, this is just normal. It's just a normal day. Just don't worry. Just sit there and just follow our lead. And then afterwards, the guy would show you a little picture and he says, oh, that's me, And I'm standing at this riot. Now, it doesn't look like a riot. It looks like a protest movement. Unless you've seen 10 or 20,000 Zulu impies coming at you. Well, or you've seen the real riots, with the, what did Winnie Mandela call it? With the necklace murders. Yeah, we've seen all those things. That's why I stopped eating pork. Why? Because when you pick up a victim like that of a necklace method of murder, it smells exactly like pork. Yeah, that's what it smells like. You think that the guys are just having some nice barbecue somewhere. No. Those are human beings being burnt alive. In the second book, I go into this in greater detail. But this IPA member would stand there and he'd show us, and look here, you see, I actually have a canister of tear gas with me. You know, I know I'm outspoken. I know I'm sarcastic sometimes when I say these things. But the first thought which comes to my head is take your tear gas and fuck off home and stay there. Don't come back here to us in South Africa and try and teach us policing. We know more about policing in Africa than you can ever imagine or dream to have. And I don't care what you are in Scotland Yard or wherever else you are. I think you're pathetic in our theatre. End of story. In this theatre, we are the best. You listen to us, not we to you. And that sadly is exactly what happened. And that's what happened to the army as well. Suddenly you have these bad teams here, British assistant training, whatever team. They started arriving. And what did they do? They just screwed up the army completely. It's only getting right now. And that's another topic. I know you guys will argue with that as well. But on Legacy, we are getting episodes together. It will only be out next year. Yeah, next year from now, today's the 5th of June. It's quite a few months from there, but by the time you're listening here, it will only be a few months, I hope. Where they're going to tell us about peacekeeping operations and how that's different from the wartime operations which you guys were doing. Yes, I understand it's a changing of time, but I will never agree that the traditions of the old SAP were wrong in any sense of the word. So by 1991, end of 91, I left and I went to university at Free State. I did law degrees, B. Juris, LLB. I did have at that stage a diploma in police administration as well. And then I carried on with a master's degree in law. And later on, that doesn't matter. So in that 5 years, 6 years at university was very different because that's where you start changing. That's where you start looking at things in a broader view. In the police, it's extremely narrow. You stay right inside what the law says and the law alone and nothing more. So for me to write the book was not just about my experience in the SAP. I mean, I had a lot of experience and I had lots of incidents I was involved with which made headline news, which I was actually there. But if I wasn't there, my unit was there. So I knew what was happening. I think of a Strydom shooting there at Strydom Square. I think of us pedophile van der Weyen. We were there. There were really a lot of things which is in the books, but that's in the second book. In the first book, I concentrate on a policeman and what makes a policeman. In other words, what happens to you once you enlist and then you go out to the police college, which is basic training. It's basic training for 6 months, which is twice as long as it is for, I think, the army. And so I always say in these lectures, if you were thinking that you could jump over army by joining the police and you're going to have a nice, good life, well, it depends on the unit and it depends on when you were doing it. If you were a slagmoer, how do I translate that into English, guys? If you were a jippergat, that's sort of Afrikaans too. If you're one of those people who don't want to bring your side and you're one of those loafers, I think a loafer, if you're a loafer and a person who don't want to serve your country and you just want to get through the system, it depends. You can join the police and you might get away with it because you might end up somewhere where you can just fly below the radar, so to speak, do as little as possible and just collect your paycheck. Yeah, it could have happened. But most of the time, by this time, after 85, most of the police recruits who graduated from a police college would go to the riot units. And in the riot units were like a military unit. So they, I always say to you, you're a magnificently stupid person if you thought you could do that. But it really depends also on what unit you were. If you were volunteering for, like me, for SAP counterinsurgency or a flying squad or a dog unit or whatever, you could really expect to be in shootouts every night. Night shift anyway. So it was not impossible for once a week to be, where people try to kill you or you try to kill somebody or shots are fired. And that brings me to another myth. And I know I say this in the other lectures as well, but guys, this thing of you being able to go and kill and murder and abuse people in the old police like you wanted to is just absolute bullshit. It's not true. There's absolutely no truth in that. Whenever you fired a shot, all hell broke loose. In the first place, you had to report that shots were fired to Romeo. Romeo will then send a duty officer, who's an experienced lieutenant. There were no young lieutenants in the flying squad. These guys were 15, 20 years experience. They would arrive. If somebody is actually hurt or injured or killed, God forbid, then it would be investigated, and it would be probably investigated by the detectives of murder and robbery. And murder and robbery were like the creme de la creme of the police detectives. This is the very best detectives in it up there. That's where everybody wanted to be. They were fantastically good. I mean, if you look at this, their solving rate on cases was something like in the 90%, which meant they always got their man. And yeah, there will be some liberals sitting here now. Well, why are you even reading my books or listening to me? But anyway, since you're here, let me educate you. Once the police actually investigated the crime, that docket then goes to a state prosecutor's office. They will then look at it from a legal viewpoint and suggest a few changes or not, and then only this fellow will go to court. Now, in the police, we did not, let me say that again to you, we did not think of the courts as our friends. Not at all. We saw the court almost as our enemies. You know why? Because we got fed up of people we knew were guilty, which we found innocent on a small, tiny part of the law. And let me tell you, as an attorney myself, who used to be one, and the human rights one for my sins, before I became a contract specialist, it's the right way. That's the way it should be. I would rather have a guilty man found innocent than an innocent man found guilty. So the system was taking care of itself. Also, the South African system was such that your lower courts, by which I don't mean they're stupid or anything, I just say you have different levels. You have your high court, which they call it today. In the old days, it was called the Supreme Court. It's only deals with, from a criminal perspective now, with very, very serious crimes. Something like aggravated rape and murder, sedition, treason, things like that. That's what the High Court would be dealing with, the Supreme Court. While the lower courts would deal with more common crimes, like theft or somebody stabbed somebody with a knife during a fight, but there's no intention to commit murder, or somebody... I hesitate to call rape a minor crime because it's really not. It's disgusting. But, sometimes both of them are under the influence, and then she has regrets the next day, and then suddenly it's rape where it wasn't rape. But whatever. I say again, it's disgusting. It's a disgusting crime to deal with, and it shouldn't happen. But then you had the lower courts, and they would deal with these things. And then you had something in between, which they called the regional courts. Now, my father was a regional court magistrate, second in seniority, I had a way of calling it tweede been, which means he was a very senior one. So he would actually do the treason trials. He would do the murder trials, the rape trials, the housebreaking in theft where it's aggravated. Those are serious crimes. And from the ranks of the state prosecutors, these magistrates would arrive. So they were trained from the beginning to basically look at the man and to see how they can find him guilty. Right? So that's the first leg of the system. The second leg of the system is where your private practitioners of law, your advocates, called barristers in the UK, they would become like Supreme Court judges. Now, a judge in the old days in South Africa was a man which was rated the same as an officer. He had to be saluted. There were no such thing as a judge ever being found guilty of anything which is, anything. It doesn't matter whether it's corruption or whatever. It was totally different than today. There was no such thing as a judge being found driving drunk or being arrested for theft or whatever. It just never happened. These people were carefully chosen from a senior council, and then they would become judges, and their entire life was spent to get people free. In other words, to get them off. And you are trained like that. Let me tell you, I've done both. I've been a defense counsel and I've been a prosecuting counsel as well. Never lost a case on both sides. But you do have a totally different way of looking at things. So if you then go on appeal to the higher court, and for certain crimes and certain sentences, it went automatically. Then the higher court, the Supreme Court, it was called that day, would automatically be looking for ways to let you off. The system balanced itself out. And that's very important to know. But your damn problem came because of a Westminster system which we used in South Africa to that stage. It is fascinating because it comes from the UK. Of course, we were a UK colony. Now, guys, what I'm explaining to you now is also in the book. That's why I'm doing it on purpose, to explain to you that in the books, the Mean Streets books are not just about Quest being a policeman. Yeah, it deals with that too. I can tell you many funny things which happen in the college, and I will. But I did think to myself that some people might want to read the book and understand why. Why did it happen that the South African police force became known internationally as an instrument of terror? And yeah, that's what they called us. And we were very disgusted with it. But the fact is, that's the name. That's what they said. It was an instrument of terror. Why did that happen? How did it happen that a highly respected police force, which was created, I think, in 1913 already, and you know, in those days, you wouldn't believe it today, but in the rural area, a police sergeant was actually a highly respected man, was a man of a church. He was probably in his 40s. He would not be a young man like me at the age of 21. He would be a married man. His children would be at school. He would be a man you could walk up to and talk to. He would be a man of real wisdom. Because the one thing you learn in the police is to read people, man. Even to today, that's why I say you can't get the DNA of your basic training or your career in the army or the police out of your intelligence service. You have that in you. It's trained into you. Even today, I can walk into a place and I can summarize it in a million of a second. And I can tell you there's something wrong here or there's something not wrong. Or I look at the couple, and many times I would say that to Rebecca, my wife. I would say, yeah, honey, these two are having a nice fight. And she would say, really? No, we're just talking. No, look at their body language. Look at how the girl is standing. Look at him. Look at this. It's like this Macron. What's that idiot of France, that president? Yeah, the imbecile. Wasn't he slapped by his wife the other day? There, when he opened the door, it was, close to Thailand, where I now live. I think in Malaysia, it's just across the border, actually. When they opened the aircraft door and suddenly you just see a fist coming at his head and smacked him right on his mouth or his nose or something. Yeah, he got bitch slapped. Well, yes, of course, people will say that his wife is actually his husband, but whatever. I'm not, I don't know and I don't care, man. It wasn't a good punch either. It was a very girly punch, to be honest. But you could see the body language after that. I mean, they were nothing friendly about those two. And they came walking down those stairs. And they can spin it as much as they want, but the fact is, we know what happened because we can see this, and that you can summarize this in seconds, and it's one of the things we learn. This is one of the things which I don't understand about the US police at all. And in one of my books, Safety Net, I actually go into the police and I look at their statistics in the US. And I came to the conclusion that basically you have a 99.99% chance of committing murder and you will get away with it. Totally. If you look at the shootings and how they carry on, you know, it's amazing. You don't need to approach a vehicle with your firearm drawn. You don't. There's no need, unless there's a reason. And if you are that dumb ass that you cannot even figure that one out, when to draw your weapon and when not, and when to shoot and when not, you have no business being a policeman. You're on very low standards, very low class, and you shouldn't do that. But then if you look at the US these days, and I call them the second beast of the Bible because that's exactly what they are, and I'll put it in for you here. It's from Oath of Evil and other books. You will actually find out that half of the US population cannot read. Yes, they cannot read above a level of standard 6, or that's your very first year in high school, or grade 8. Very first year, you're 14 years old. That's your reading level. That's your capability. Half of you cannot even read. So in other words, you have no training. You don't understand. It's as I say there, Biden is good and Trump is bad. You know, if an idea why you say that. No. And you see the problem here. You take a gorilla like that and you give him a firearm and a badge, and now he's approaching a vehicle. He's already worked himself up because he's pissing off fear. And now he's coming there, and he knows he's going to get away with abusing you, killing you. Yeah, that's why you have this nonsense. That's why you have, when the SWAT team started in the US, you had about 54 calls a year for them to go out once a week. That's across the entire US, and it's a very, very big place. How much today? Hundreds of times every day. What happens? Kick the door down, wrong door, storm the wrong house, shoot the dog, shoot the owner, and they get away with it. How fantastic. They get away with it. We couldn't. That's my entire point. There's no way in the world we could behave like damn hooligans and get away with it. This wouldn't have happened. The other way, which I explain to people, is the Israeli army at some stage had a thing going where the Palestinians would be protesting on their side of the fence, and they would be protesting there and probably throw stones there at the Israelis. And then the Israeli snipers would shoot everyone in the left knee. Yeah. Go and research. You think we could have gotten away with that? Oh, please. In the first place, we wouldn't deploy snipers for such shite. And secondly, there's no way in the world we could have gotten away with it. There just is no way. So it was a highly disciplined force. Yes, I'm sure there were people who did things wrong. But I tell you that, if you get caught out there, you're in serious trouble. But let me talk about the Westminster system. I want to tell you about it because that will explain a lot of things to you. Now, of course, at this stage, I had no clue. When I was doing my basic training, I had no clue what I'm telling you now about. This came with many years of law later. But it's interesting, it's fascinating because it will explain to you why the police became an instrument of terror in the eyes of our enemies. The Westminster system was used in basically 170 countries. But it was only in South Africa where it became an apartheid system, which is very interesting. Because you can even argue about that and look at the case system in India and look at you can call it a case system in the UK too, where you have definitely these days you have a two-tier type of legal system, one for them and one for the rest of you. But that was predicted in the Bible as well. The fact is, it came from a British Parliament, which says that the Parliament is sovereign. In other words, what they said is, if a Parliament decided something, then that is decided, end of story. So, if a Parliament then decided something which is inherently unfair, like the apartheid laws were, no doubts about it. Don't believe your dominee who told you it's from the Bible. It's not. Then that unfair law is going to stand in court simply because it was created by Parliament and Parliament is sovereign. Practically speaking, let me explain to you. There was a case called the Harris case. You can go and research it if you really want to. It was in the 1950s. Now, remember in 1948, the Nats took over from Jannie Smuts when he lost the election. And basically, the South African party disappeared, which was the party which my dad and his people, all of them, voted that side. A bunch of supper. My mother, of course, was not from a national party. And up to then, the coloured people in South Africa, in the Cape Town, in the Cape Province, actually had to vote. And coloured people, and I have to explain to people here who don't know what I mean. When I say coloured people, I don't mean a black person. I mean a person of mixed race. And they're wonderful people. There's nothing wrong with them. They speak Afrikaans as a home language. You find them there down in the Cape, also in the Northern Cape, a lot of them. Sadly, these days, when I was last in South Africa, I would speak Afrikaans to them, and they would just ignore me flat until I speak English to them. Well, yeah, you get no tip. Sorry, you're stupid. You're stupid because, you should try and please the client. If people arrive here in my place where we know, and we open and people arrive and they speak French, then both Rebecca and myself will probably speak French back to them, make them feel welcome. I don't lower my standards by doing that. Some people would say I lower my standards by speaking English to people. Just a joke, guys. The fact is, you try to keep your client happy, and there's nothing wrong if a man greets you in your own language, which your parents spoke, just to say hello back in that language. You try and ignore him. Don't complain when the guy don't give you a tip. You're being racist. But I felt that in South Africa, it's actually quite shocking and unnecessary. There's no need for that. Totally no need. If you live overseas, you will know what I mean. If you walk down the street and you hear somebody speak Afrikaans, you feel an inclination to walk up and say, "Hey, what are you doing here? Are you on holiday? You want to come and have a coffee at my house?" That type of thing. I don't do it anymore because it's a useless exercise, but you have that feeling, and especially when you're in the shadows, like I was in the great game afterwards, you have to you actually trained against that. One of the training scenarios I would put up is you walk into a place and there's two people talking Afrikaans, and they would actually be recording you to see if you react to that, if you're listening to what they're saying, or you're making eye contact, or they put the Afrikaans magazine like Huisgenoot is also there. You just ignore it, because you're not supposed to be able to understand or speak the language. You would be switching into whatever your legend is. But besides that, let's not worry about that now. The fact is, the coloured people had the vote, and the National Party decided they don't want these coloured people to have a vote because it's whites and whites only. It's an apartheid system, which was started by the Brits, by the way. The first two acts which the British colonial power brought in after 1902 with the surrender at Vereniging, where the Boer Republic stopped being existing. The first two acts they brought in was the one against mixed marital races. Up to that stage, there were no such laws. And the other one was the Group Areas Act. In other words, white people live here, black people live there. That also didn't exist up to that stage. So it was actually British colonial power who started apartheid, if you want to be fair. And also when they wiped out 1/3 of the Boer nation, women and children, and a lot of black people in their concentration camps during that war, yes, it was the British Army who started the concentration camps in the modern era. Yeah, they were once before. I know the history, I know better than you. But in South Africa, that is where the concentration camps came in during the Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War. British Army started it. Stop denying what is true. And while I'm talking to you, explain to me why you had almost no casualties during the Second World War. Yes, go and read Codename Caribbean. I discuss it there. I am not going into it again. I'll just get upset, and I will upset a lot of people, which is fine too. But the point is, we needed to take away this law, but they couldn't, because the law said for you to take away the right of the coloured people to vote, you need a 2/3 majority in Parliament. Internationalists didn't have a 2/3 in the majority. So they came up with a scam. So they said, okay, what we'll do is we will create our own court of parliament or something like that. And then they're going to ram this legislation through it. And then, of course, this same court of theirs are just going to say, yeah, no problem. And that's exactly what happened. And then a guy called Harris stood up and he went to the actual courts, and the courts told the parliament, what the hell's wrong with you? Does the law not say where's 2/3? Where's your 2/3? And they don't have 2/3, and so Court of Appeal just told him to take a hike because it's not a lawful law. It is have no effect or consequence, and therefore goodbye, go away. Right. So now the nationalists are very pissed off. They're really angry. So what they did is they changed the law, all the laws, to make sure that in an area where they have the majority, they would split that district into 5 or 6 different sub-districts. And now suddenly of having just one member of parliament, they have 5 or 6 from the same district. You see what's happening. So they're stacking the parliament, and suddenly they have the 2/3. And so they put the law through again, and now 2/3 say, aye, yes, aye, right, we vote for this. And there goes the colored vote. Guys, I summarized this for you in layman's language. If you're an attorney, don't get angry with me. I'm not in court now. I'm just explaining like normal people can understand what we're talking about, because no one else does. That's how we make money. And so they went to court again, and this time the Court of Appeals had to say, guys, I'm sorry. They followed the law. They followed Parliament's sovereignty. I could say the word just now. Now I can't. My house trains. But anyway, so they followed the law by having enough votes, and therefore it was signed by the state president, the prime minister, I don't know at that stage, and therefore it's the law of the country, end of story, and that's how you create unfair laws. Now, today you would not be able to do that because there's a court of the Constitution, and there's certain constitutional rights inside the Constitution, and that is guaranteed, which means that it can be tested against the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which means that you have that extra layer of security. But in those days of a parliamentary system which was working and in fact enforced in the Westminster system, there was no such thing. Now, why didn't that work like that in the rest of the countries? Why were there no such laws in the UK and other places? Now, in the first place, the UK at that stage was a white country. You can argue about it today, and I don't want to do the racist thing here. It doesn't matter. Not my concern. I like what's going wrong with the UK. I thoroughly enjoy it. They thoroughly deserve it. And I'm still waiting for the apology for your murders in the concentration camps. But besides that, they had no fear of black people because they would always vote them out. Doesn't matter. And South Africa was different because South Africa knew, because of the killings and the murders in the concentration camps, there were a lot less whites than black people. But do you know that before those murders took place, the two populations were actually quite even? They were quite even. So it might never have gone this way if it wasn't for the concentration camps murders. That's what the theory says, that they would have been able to find each other because they were sort of the same in the sense of how many people they were. So they had they weren't worried about it at all. But in South Africa, it was totally different because we knew a one man, one vote would always end up with a white man being, thrown to the wolves, which is exactly what happened. It is exactly what happened. And with that came, of course, the great revenge, which is called affirmative action. Yes, affirmative action. Let me tell you something about that. There's not a single country in the world where affirmative action actually worked. Not one. No, not one. And South Africa is the only country in the world where it's against a minority. Yeah. Tell me, you takare, you liberals, how do you explain that to me? All you want to say to me is for the past, two wrongs make a right. Yeah. No, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. You're an idiot. And more than that, where does it end? Tell me, where does it end? We're now in the second generation after the changes. Why is all your doctors gone? Why is all your engineers? Why have they left? Tell me. Why is all your farmers leaving now? Huh? Tell me, where's the roads? Where's the infrastructure? Tell me, where's the investments? All those things you promised, huh? What happened to that? Oh, tell me, where's the rand? I live in Thailand. I'm very happy in Thailand. I don't want to go back. Why should I? But you know what? If I have to, I will. But the point is, 6, 7 years ago, if you came to Thailand as a South African, your rand was worth, what was it? 8 baht. 8 baht. What's it worth today? About 1. Yeah. If you're lucky, 2. So it's 1 on 1. So in other words, the rand has gone down, what, 700% in 6 years. Yeah. 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 I remember in the 1960s, do you actually know this, that 1 rand was worth $2? Yeah. 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 1 rand is worth $2. Yeah. The other day I saw that 1 rand is 17 or 18 or 19 rand is now worth $1. Yeah. Went well, didn't it? Huh? You did fantastically well. Anyway, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We'll survive that too. Point I'm making is, if a parliament then decide to make an unfair law and they do it in the correct way, they can do it. But it never happened in the UK because there was no need for that to happen. And of course, the UK people, the Englishmen will say to you, he's inherently a fair man. He's inherently a guy who's not going to do something which is wrong, which he knows is wrong in his heart. But you know, he might be right. As much as I dislike people like Churchill for their lies and think there's something to say about the Pukar English officer and gentleman, and there's something to say about these people. And there's something to say about their traditions. Whether you like them or not doesn't matter. The fact is they brought the railway, science, all sorts of things to Africa, which you have to give them credit for. And they did not bring out these discriminatory laws until very recently, when of course they changed. So there's a point there. They have a point. And the opposite then would be true to us, that we were people who were fighting for survival and we're in a survival mood. And that's why, you know, they decided they will remove the voting rights of the colored people, and then came the other apartheid laws. It's rightly called you know, discrimination. And also against, you know, human nature. All those things. I mean, love is love, man. I spoke to people on Legacy Conversations, and a guy would say to me, living in America now, and he would say to me, of course, you know, my wife is not white, you know, she's Mexican, or you know, she's actually black. And he says it to me like he's scared of it. Guys, you know, love is blind, man. Love is blind. It's really, but anyway. So now you understand the Westminster system. So you understand now that now you have a parliament who can actually make laws, which is wrong. It's wrong, wrong, wrong. But now what happens? Now you have a highly experienced and disciplined police force. And this police force is going to enforce those laws, because the police can do nothing about it. At the end of the day, whether you like it or not, the law says, and I take a sample, which I always take an example, is the law says no black people allowed in a white area after 10 o'clock at night. That's the pass laws. And the reason why they do that is because they think the black people are criminals and they're going to steal and rape and plunder there, so they don't want them there. Okay. Some people will say that's a good reason. And if you say that, if you follow the American South, which was just as bad, even worse than us, they would have a separate but equal rule. So in other words, yeah, okay, you can do that, but then, of course, the white people shouldn't be there in the black people's area either, which I would call a nigger. Now, it's not me saying it. I'm using their words. Don't put words in my mouth. Not a racist. I will sue you if you come out with nonsense telling me I'm a racist or something. That's nonsense. And so we're always there. So now you're in the police, you drive down the street, here you see a black guy, he's walking back home. Yeah, what are you doing here? No, you know, I was visiting my wife and I'm just walking back. Oh, okay, well, you're on arrest because the law says you're not allowed to be here. Now the guy's arrested. Now he can't go to work because he's in jail. He's been held in the police cells. Then he goes to a magistrate's court. Magistrate might be in a very foul mood for some reason. So instead of just warning the guy and telling him to go home, now he suddenly gets he has to pay a fine. He doesn't have a fine, so now he stays in jail. or the magistrate says, no, I think we should perhaps give him a few, cuts with a cane. So the police now have to cane the guy, which is a dreadful sight. Dreadful. Let me tell you, I am totally against that type of thing. I've seen it in the Middle East. I've seen it here. I mean, not Thailand. I've seen it in the police. I've seen it. I'm totally against that type of thing. It's inhuman. It should never happen. And of course, it happened to us all the time at school as well, because you have these teachers who's totally, I don't know. I think some of them were playing with themselves while they were, doing that or whatever. I mean, I've seen this, especially if you have a Kortgat syndrome, Maniki. That's a short man syndrome in English. I've seen a lot of them, and they would absolutely pick on the poor children, the poorer children who didn't have influential parents, like I did. I have to say that of my parents. I had fantastic parents, and they would stand up for their children. And he took liberties with us. My dad would be there. And as a regional magistrate, he was a man who was very, very highly respected. And so we were protected a lot more than I would say the children who lived in the orphanage. Yeah, you all know what I'm talking about. I'm not saying that the child doesn't always deserve what he's getting. Not at all. I'm not saying that. But you all know that there's boundaries, and you all know that the boundaries was many, many times broken. Yeah, it happened. It happened a lot. But anyway, to make a long story short, that was the legal system. So that is when the South African police force, when they started implementing these laws at a big scale, of course, they became known as the instrument of terror. So what I'm saying to you is, don't blame the police. Don't blame the guy who's walking there down the street on beat, or driving down the street, or a guy standing in their riot uniforms. And the law says you're not allowed to have a riot or a meeting within 100 or 200 yards from a court while it's in session, because you'll be bothering the court and you'll be trying to influence the court. There's no such thing as a jury system, by the way, since the 1960s, which is a good thing too. But the law says that. So now you punks arrive and you're going to, start your nonsense very close to the court. Now the police arrive, or they're already there, because they know it's a famous trial taking place. Now arrives the damn journalists, all of them liars, all of them, every single one of them. Don't trust them. Don't trust a journalist. No, not at all. And so the police would then come out and they would warn and say, guys, the law says this and this. Here's the law, quoting it for you. We're giving you 15 minutes. Please disperse. Please go home. Don't stay here. If you fail to do it, we're going to remove you. Right. Now, that's exactly what the guy, of course, wants, because now the journalists are there, which they want beforehand. Yeah, we've got all the evidence. We even have evidence of a journalist, especially the overseas ones, paying people to stone the police with stones, throw stones at them so that the police can shoot them with birdshot or tear gas or something, and then, it's headline news. And that's how they play the game, man. We knew this. We're not stupid. We knew it. And so this is exactly then what happens. The police are there now, and you don't disperse. And so the order comes. Honor, storm. And storm in. And then you do. You have a baton, you have a sjambok, which is a whip, or whatever you have. Some people call it a donkey pill, which is, I'm not going to translate. And you just moor, which is a translation for you just assault them grievously. And then they run. Because there's no way you're going to stand still while that's been happening. In later years, we couldn't do that anymore. The baton charges and things came to an end in the middle 80s or later 80s, because you would be shot dead. It was just not possible. So you would start using birdshot or tear gas, whatever. There was ways how you could escalate it all the time. Or you're standing at some university, I think of Wits, it's a very liberal university. And guess what would happen? They would start burning the flag of the land, which we treasured. We bled for that flag. And so, of course, the order would come, guys, storm. And then you storm it. And there would always be one or two which you fight before. Probably a very pretty girl or Takar was especially obnoxious and stinking of garlic and eating with his hat on his head. So you would think, gonna get you, boot, gonna get you. And then you get him. Guys, whose fault is this? Where does all this go back to? If you say to a highly disciplined policeman, go and sort that guy out, what the hell do you think is going to happen? He's going to storm that guy and sort him out. End of story. End of story. So if you want to attach blame, if you want to call the old South African police force the instrument of terror, tell me, what do you call Parliament? Tell me, I'm interested to know. Well, what do you call the parliamentarians? Those who voted for those laws. Yeah. Those who ran for their pensions afterwards. You know, those who started washing feet. Yeah. Tell me, what do you call those wankers? What do you call them? Think about it. Because that is exactly what went wrong with the police and what went wrong with in South Africa. And I hope you understand this now, because that was the purpose of the entire book. Well, that entire series was actually written to get this message to you. Don't blame the police for what the Parliament ordered them to do. Because you as a military man will say to me, yes, because it's true. But you know, legally, since the Second World War and the war crime tribunals which happened afterwards at Nuremberg, it came out that if an order is illegal, then by law, you who is receiving the order should refuse. Yes, it's true. Guys, I agree. It's totally true. So in other words, if a law said that go and arrest everybody who's baldy like me, and you go and arrest a guy who has a whole bunch of liberal hair, like a mop or something, then of course I would say, sir, with respect, I cannot follow your order because the law says this and this. And whether the lieutenant plucks his moor or 10 places doesn't matter, but the fact is, I'm not going to follow the order. But guys, what do you do when the order is actually lawful? What do you do? And you see the difference. The orders were not unlawful. They were not illegal. If I can go back to a flag burning, manne, storm, it's a legal order. It's not illegal. It will become illegal if a guy says, okay, tell you what, shoot the guy who's burning the flag dead. Or shoot him with your R1 rifle in the left knee. That's an illegal order because it's taking it too far. You know what I mean? So it was a very difficult position to be in. And you can imagine when you're 18 years old, 19 years old, you just graduated from a police college. Some of the guys graduated at the age of 17, 16. And you suddenly find yourself in that world. And then you have to read the second book to understand what I'm talking about. And you have to decide. And you have to decide within a millionth of a second, I'm going to shoot or I'm not going to shoot. Because the courts was your enemy. You have all the time in the world to decide whether you're right or wrong. Yeah, all the time. All the time. And if you then get arrested, you lose your income immediately. You're suspended without pay. So you lose your house, you lose your car, you lose whatever you can lose. Not that you had much because we were poor to begin with. In fact, a sweeper with a broom in the South African beer breweries were getting more money as me as a sergeant in the police. And in the beginning of a few years, the first 3, 4, 5 years, it's not a problem because, man, you're having fun. It's great. It's a great job. Best job in the world. But afterwards, when you think about marriage or you think about children or you think about, man, perhaps it would be nice to have a car which is not so old, which my dad didn't buy for me. You know, at that stage, for me, the greatest thing in the world was a car with a rev counter and a tape deck with 4 speakers, my man, not 2, 4. And perhaps a sunroof. Yeah. Aircon? Nah, there was no such thing as cars with aircon, man. The doctors and lawyers had them. And if you were of a rank of colonel and higher in the police, you could get a car with air conditioning. It was totally strange to have such things. And then that's when you started thinking, man, I don't know if this is worth it. Every day we risk our lives and we just get shitted upon by everybody. And you go to the richer areas like Waterkloof, sometimes they would ask you, please don't stop here in front of our gates. We don't want the people to see that the police are here. Okay, can you just go to the back, like we're flipping servants or something, or delivery boys. We stop in front of a gate and keep a siren on so that everybody knows we're there. And that's the thing which we had. And then the constant hatred. You go into the townships, you go into these rich liberal areas, you just hate it. I hate you. It was not an easy life. After 6 years, I burnt out, and but that's in the second book as well. Of course, I made a few notes here, but I really spoke about everything I wanted to. Look, it's a funny book to read. There's a lot of very, very funny incidents which are in the book, as well as events following. I'll just tell you one, which is a bit of a crude joke. You have to forgive me, but it was the times of the day. It was right at the end. So the last 3 weeks at the police college, you're actually doing nothing, except practicing for the passing out parade, which is a very big deal. And there are actually videos and pictures of that around. See if I can find some, but basically it's in two different ways. There's a PT display of which I was part of. Can you believe that? And then there's also the parade itself. There's first the parade, and then there's a display parade, which would be done by half the people, say about 600, 700 men and women. And then there's the PT parade, also about 700 men. Now, I can still do every single one of that PT parade, 21 of their exercises where you start off and then the hand goes there and then that. It's totally synchronized. It's really something special. It's really something to see. But we were not nearly as good as the black guys at Mamanskral. I mean, they were fantastic. They would do that while we're singing. Yeah, if you've ever seen that, you will know what I'm talking about. But it's a very big day, because for once you're done with a bloody college, you want to get out in the streets and go and arrest some people or get hold of the criminals, but actually just to escape the college, man, just to get away from the instructors. I don't think the instructors were that good. I say it in my books. I think they lacked experience. Many of them stayed on, so they had no practical experience as policemen. They just stayed on. And if they were in the PTIs or something, no problem. They were very famous PTIs. I mean, they were famous boxers, people who fought world champion boxers. The police always had something about boxers. If you could use your fist, you would be very welcome there. And of course, you did have to use your fist in the main streets. And so there they had a fantastic way of doing things. Yeah, they would line up 2 platoons, and then you would box against each other. But this wasn't really boxing, because if you box against each other while training, it's not a big deal. You just punch a few people. If you don't like the guy, you can try and punch him for real or he for you. You put in a bit of a spirited fight, but nothing serious. But man, then it comes a day where they line up platoons against each other. No, you dislike that other platoon immensely. This is esprit de corps, you're better and they are not. End of story. And we quickly found out the guys from Namibia, they were also there from Southwest. They had a platoon there. Those were big mobbers and they could really swing. And then you also had to be careful of the ones from Durban, because they were knife fighters. And then you had to be especially careful of the karate kids, because they would kick, they would go into a fighting mode. I saw that once, where I wouldn't say the instructor's name. He was a very famous boxer, so he got this guy. He's going to box him now, teach him a few lessons. So this guy is a black belt in something. He just turned and just kicked the guy against the head. Well, I suppose he's still running around there at the shooting range. Shame. But it was and some guys could really fight, and others couldn't. But it doesn't matter, because when you're out in the streets, you have to be able to handle yourself. So they would line you up, and it didn't really matter on size. They couldn't care less. I mean, you could go against a guy who was quite small, but he's quick. And then you yourself is much bigger, but you're stronger. So if you can hit him, it's man down. So they line up, and then you would see a line of them there on the other side, and you lining up there, and then you can count. And you can work out plus minus who's your opponent, so you'll give him the would kill you, it's got a cop. You just work him, psych him up there. And he's doing the same thing that side. So by the time that you get those gloves on, man, you're jumping around like a rabbit. And you just swing. Man, you swing. And that was interesting. But even the girls, even the female the female cadets, they would also be swinging merrily there at each other. Yeah, but they were treated different. In the first place, they were weighed every week. Yeah, they came out on legacy every week. They had to put on a scale. There were no such thing as a fat female constable in those days. And of course, even a fat constable in male, if you get overweight, they knew how to treat you, man. They were always a course at Milieuskop or Verdrag or someplace you could go to. And anyway, that's the one story I wanted to tell you that was interesting. The other interesting thing is when we were passing out and we were practicing this, when I was telling you about, I had a sergeant there with the most beautiful voice. I don't know where they got him from. He was not a local. He was probably from headquarters. And he was there and he had this very fantastic voice, really manly, deep voice. He would do all the announcements. And the police orchestra was there as well. Not the college one. We could play only one bloody song. Every single day they would play this Little Drummer Girl or something. Little Drummer Boy. Sorry, I was thinking of a book. Little Drummer Girl. It's a fantastic book if you haven't read it. Mossad agent. But Little Drummer Boy, they would play that thing every day after parade. Even if I hear it today, I see I was just marching off. And so he would announce, and when he would go through the entire parade, so he would say something. He was speaking Afrikaans, I'm translating now. He would say something, like, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome His Excellency General so-and-so." And then he starts mentioning his medals, PC, whatever, and then you say, DOOSAAP, and then he would spell it out, Now, for you people who don't understand Afrikaans, he just called the man the parts that the man doesn't have, that the female does. That's what DOOS. It can also mean a box, just a box. That's what he explained anyway, but really not. And AAP, of course, stands for an ape or a gorilla. Yeah, and he would say such things, and I could see the RSM. Now, we didn't really have an RSM like the army, but there was a warrant officer there who I'm still trying to get on legacy. He's very old now. Patrolling he was called. Man, you could hear that guy 6 miles away. Such a fantastic parade ground noise. He was a typical military type of guy, and he was a fantastic man. And he would bring them all to attention, and he just walked up to this guy and started talking to him. But he wasn't shouting. He would just put his arm around him. He was like very fatherly, which is police speak. When you say you're getting fatherly, it means you're getting. The next step is going to be a beating. The guy stopped his nonsense, but we had to laugh about it. It was quite funny. There were really a lot of things in the police college which were funny. I recall at one stage they said there was a ghost somewhere. Some recruit actually committed suicide. Yeah, that happened too. The pressure was just on, The pressure was massive. As I say in the book, it would take an 18-year-old young man who was fit and tough. You would run him to the ground with lack of sleep and just physical all the time. And then there's the mental as well, because it's like school almost. You have to go through all these legal courses as well, like the judge's rules, which is like you have to warn the guy and to say to him, look, you're arrested for such and such a reason. You have a right to remain silent. You have a right to call an attorney of your choice. If you don't have one, we will provide one through the state. Blah, blah, blah. You know the rules. You see it in the movies all the time. Well, we had our own version of that, and it was something like this. I'm not saying it did happen. It could have happened. Okay. I say, you're under arrest for so-and-so. You have a right to remain silent. But I will advise you not to use that right, you bloody bastard. And that would be followed up with a few punches, just to get him in the right mood. And if you want an attorney, well, we shoot your attorney at sight. He's an asshole too. Blah, blah, blah. The problem here is you're dealing with a criminal element and a terrorist, both of them, and sometimes they're the same thing. The problem here, guys, is if you arrest a guy, let's say Van Rooyen. Now, we couldn't get Van Rooyen alive. If we got him alive, he would have spoken to us. But by that time, Van Rooyen was already unconscious. I know, I was there. First, he shot the Tony, then he shot himself. We didn't shoot him. This is a very famous pedophile case. And there were lots of others of it, which is in the book, which I can tell you about. Actually, more of a second book. But if you find a guy and you know he committed a murder or he kidnapped a child or he did something and we don't know where that child is or we don't know where the body is, and you ask him politely enough twice where he's what he's done and he should talk to us, it's the right thing to do, you know. Confess your sins. But that's not biblical, by the way. You can only confess your sins to God. You can confess your faults to each other. It's not the same thing. It's one of the Bible verses I actually changed. Go and read Oath of Evil, you'll find out what else came from confessing your sins to a priest. Yeah. Of course, you go to church every Sunday on in the police college as well, and rugby and sport is mandatory. There's no way you cannot do it. But the fact is, sometimes in life when you deal with a criminal, you have to force him to tell you where he is. And in those days, the laws were such that if you can get a guy to show you the body, it is logical that he was involved in the crime, then otherwise he could not show you where the body is buried. Isn't that logical? And therefore, that part of his confession, which was then gotten out of him, would stand in court. Today, it's totally different. Today, they say if there's any force used upon the guy, even if he can show you the body, it will still not be admitted in court. And the reason why they did that is to stop forcible and enforced, or let me rather say reinforced confessions. But after a while in the police, it comes out in the second book, you get hard. Man, you lose your faith in humanity and you get very, very hard. It's a tough, it's tough. You meet with a scum of the earth. But anyway, so the first book, as I said, in 2012, I was in a tough time. I was about to emigrate to the US to get married to, I was married to Melissa already. But at that stage, my past caught up with me, the ones in the shadows. And I couldn't get a visa. I was refused entry in the US. Very stupid. If you ask me why, I've got no idea, but I can think of quite a few reasons why. But the wrong reasons. I'm not a terrorist or whatever else. And so I couldn't get to the US, so I ended up living with my mom. I took care of her for 8 years in Bloemfontein. And in that 8 years, I wrote books. And I wrote this one. It's the first book ever. It was very roughly written in the beginning. I asked people to help me with the editing. Of course, I refused. That's my ex-family. And still the book became a major, I wouldn't call it a seller, but it became quite popular overseas especially. Met a lot of people through it. It was fantastic. I wrote the second one as well. In fact, at first it was just one very long book of almost 600 pages. Now it's about 340 pages and another 400 pages for a second one, which was too long for one book, I felt at that stage, and that's why it's split into two. The Afrikaans boek, Gewetenlose Strate, is still one book, covering both Mean Streets 1 and Mean Streets 2. But that's when I wrote it, and then I had no idea what to do with the book. I had no clue. I didn't know anything. And so I figured it out, and the book came live, and I still have friends. I still have people who read it. It's not being read that much today anymore. Lots of other people have written books. But those who read it and actually liked the book said it's probably the best book written on the South African police force ever. Their words, not mine. I think there's others who's better. But it's just my story. It's my story with a much wider angle to it. So it is available actually in South Africa on print on demand. I'll leave the links. It's also available on Amazon on audio. Kindle as well as hardcover and softcover. And that's it. Rebecca edited it later for me, so now it reads a lot better than what it used to. And yeah, if you want to know about those times, please have a look at it and let me know how it went. So until we meet again, God bless.
Di Patriot Sierra.